That was the short answer, by the way.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Inside the D. Today, we have a very special guest, legendary football commentator Phil Schoen. Phil, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here and appreciate the kind words. Just blessed to do what I love and had a great time with some great people.
Amazing. Was your heart always set on announcing soccer, or did you have other sports you wanted to cover?
That's a good question. I'm not going to say I stumbled into this because I grew up loving sports broadcasting. And I would also say that I grew up probably more a fan of just the regular North American sports, just because soccer wasn't that prevalent, even here in Miami. But I would be like the first kid in line at 7-Eleven to get a Street and Smith or Athlons or Who's Who or whatever. But right around that time, like right around, I guess, early teen years, maybe a few years earlier, PBS, of all places, ended up carrying a couple of shows called Soccer Made in Germany and Star Soccer, which was highlights from England. And my friends and I used to watch that. I think it was, if I remember, it was like noon on Saturday and noon on Sunday, maybe 11 a.m. And as soon as it was over, we'd hop on our bikes and race to the park and try and do everything we'd just seen. So I kind of fell in love with soccer a little bit. And then right around that same time, maybe a year or so later, the NASL was expanding and they put a team in Miami. And there were some good players that were there, but it was kind of lost in the shadow of the Dolphins at that time, who were playing some amazing football of the American variety. However, the next year, and I kind of remember driving around with my mom listening to some of the Miami games on radio, but never had the chance to see them. The next year, they ended up getting bought by the Dolphins owner, or I guess officially by his wife, and they moved him up to Fort Lauderdale, which was a little bit closer to my house. And me and my friends used to hop in one of my friend's mom's Volkswagen bus, and we'd all drive up to Lockhart Stadium and probably saw just about every single home game as long as they were there, or at least till I went away to college. And that just solidified it more and more. But I was the type of kid that would be taking a radio to bed under my pillow and just like move the dial little bit by little bit to try and hear what was going on and catch games from Atlanta, St. Louis, New York, Chicago. I remember catching a Vin Scully game with the Dodgers once. I don't know how that signal bounced around, but so I loved sports broadcasting and I loved soccer. But when I got into it, it was more because I wanted, I don't want to say have fun, but it was just something enjoyable and something I wanted to experience. So my high school, when I was there, fortunately had radio and television production facilities. So I got a chance to do like some of the basketball games, and then they would air it the next day in the cafeteria. I hope they've burned all those tapes. And then it was just enough to the point where I said, hey, this is kind of fun. So when I started looking for a college, I wanted something where I could do that. And there's a few really good colleges that have sports broadcasting. Some of them, you have to wait your turn, shall we say, and maybe by your senior year, you're lucky enough to do women's lacrosse. Nothing against women's lacrosse, but I didn't want to wait. I would rather try and get as much experience on the microphone as possible. And I ended up going to Bowling Green and did that for 4 years. And again, it was just one of those situations where further along, the more I realized this is nice, I'd like to do it. But even back then, and maybe even especially back then, because we didn't have the huge number of channels that are out there with all of the broadcast, now non-broadcast and OTT things that are going on. I just knew how difficult it was. I mean, there's only one Al Michaels, and he was pretty much doing everything even back then. So got a job in New Jersey at the biggest news radio station in New Jersey, which sounds good, but when you consider everything in New Jersey is basically in New York or Philadelphia, it was actually a nice little pocket because it gave me a chance to work on some of the college games for Rutgers and do some high school stuff myself and sharpen things up. It was also the time where Alexi Lawless and Peter Vermees were both playing at Rutgers. And the coach was Bob Riasu, who was a good recruiter, good manager, and a very good marketer. And he actually had talked the radio station I was in, which was the Rutgers flagship, into doing a coach's show, just like they do for football, baseball, basketball, etc. He talked him into doing that. And I just pestered my boss with ideas and subjects and things for that first year, to the point where the second year he finally just handed it to me. And it was just one of those little things where I'm so focused on doing something that I love, and other people ended up catching it. And there were some minor back then, I guess it really wasn't minor or major because there was no NASL, but there was a league that had a team up in North Jersey, and they were going to do a game on television because John Harkes, I think, was playing with Albany at the time, and Albany was coming to town. So I ended up doing the game. I don't think John was even able to play though, but it was just one of those light bulb moments. But at the same point, I'm feeling all up and excited, and I go down to the dressing room afterwards, and there's these players who are basically just beaten up after playing on the artificial turf, getting checks with maybe like $50 or whatever in it if they were lucky. And it just kind of opened my eyes that, okay, there's still a lot of work to do. So as I'm feeling up, there was also kind of this depressing overtone that I don't think a lot of fans understand nowadays, with the plethora of soccer that's available both domestically and abroad. But it was something that I liked, and I ended up, for personal reasons, going back to Ohio, started my own coach's show with the soccer coach at Bowling Green, the late Gary Palmisano, who was brilliant. We did that, and kind of the same thing happened. Someone that was organizing a friendly for the U.S. Olympic team. They were going to play Panama, and kind of coincidentally, Alexi was playing on that team as well. Dante Washington, a few others. Ended up going down towards Cincinnati and calling that game. It was 7-0, and it was just really fun to be on the road calling a soccer game. But there still wasn't much going on. There were rumors that things were happening, but nothing was really going on. And I knew I wanted to get back either home or just take the next step. Came to Miami, got a job offer from a radio station, but to be a producer with maybe a chance to go on air. Didn't want to do that because I've heard horror stories. Sometimes you just get trapped. A lot of people will get the chance to work through, but sometimes you get pigeonholed. And I wanted to do more soccer. There was a team in Dallas that had just won a berth in the CONCACAF Champions League, and just a minor league team, a great story, called the Dallas Rockets. And since they were going to be in the Champions League, they were talking about doing some of the games on broadcast, and I figured, why not give it a shot? So I went down, started working in the front office. The broadcasting never really worked out, but I learned some of the inner workings of soccer teams. Plus, Thomas Dooley came over with Kaiserslautern. Hugo Sanchez came up with Club America, and it was just a good fit. But the end of the season comes, same thing. I mean, basically, wasn't that long ago that end of the season comes and the players pretty much have to go find a real job, or that's one reason that some of the indoor leagues worked. But at the same point, like maybe a month after, the radio station I'd interviewed with in Miami had just gotten the rights for the Marlins, so they would decide to go all sports, and they flew me down, hired me, and I ended up being, I think, maybe the second or third voice that was on the air there after. And forgive me for rambling on, but it's just kind of, I guess, showing that sometimes what might look like a rather direct path has lots of twists and turns. But back in those days, the Strikers were back in the A-League. I ended up doing some of those games on local cable, used that to kind of get my foot in for some of the regional cable, like the Fox Sports of the world, Sunshine, etc., and did some more soccer, but also some football and basketball. And I guess I was young enough and dumb enough to realize, not to realize that I didn't have a chance. So I just pieced all these things together, sent it off to ESPN and say, hey, I'd love to be a World Cup announcer. And the thing is, they actually liked the tape, but all of the World Cup spots were taken. But they said, hey, Major League Soccer is going to be starting up. Would you be interested? And of course. However, it ended up getting pushed back a year. So I'm still kind of waiting. But so I put it there and just kind of let it be. Get a phone call. Okay, we're down to like the final 20. We're down to the final 10. We're down to the final 5, down to the final 3. And somehow I'm still in the mix. And I don't know if I was number 1 automatically, but I know that one of the guys that I was competing with was a sportscaster in Cleveland. And in those first couple of years of Major League Soccer, the weekly game was going to be on Thursday, and he couldn't get out on Thursday. So I ended up getting the opportunity to do MLS, and that lasted for 5 amazing years. But then Disney had bought ESPN. Their share prices were going down, and part of the realization of the real world when it comes to this is ESPN was basically told no contract renewals for freelancers. So now I'm out of work. And I was doing freelancing and stuff for a year. Umbro came in, started a company to work with USL to publicize, and they ended up putting games on Fox. I ended up doing that for a couple of years, but then they went bankrupt. And now I'm kind of freelancing again. I'm having some second thoughts. I think God was just humbling me a little bit, but I heard rumors that Gold TV was going to start out. But I had to wait another year. Then they started with Spanish about 6 months before English. So I had to wait a little bit more. And somehow ended up getting to that point, and Gold TV started, brought in Serie A, eventually La Liga, tons of games. And it was, again, nothing that I had planned, but along the way, it just kind of moved me in that direction to do something that I loved, and was there for 10 years until BN Sports came around and gave me a call. And now I've been here for about 10 years. So I guess the idea would be follow your heart, keep your eye on your goal, but don't put blinders on, because sometimes there might be a door that's open just to the left or just to the right. And also just be prepared. I mean, sometimes you'll get to where you think you like, and it's not really it. So I guess just not to throw all of your eggs in one basket, but kind of be ready for anything.
Yeah, that's super
That was
cool.
the short answer, by the way.
Yeah, it's super cool. It's like kind of keep your eyes open to what can kind of pop up and take it when it comes. And then, so I think that we all kind of want to know, what is that one game that's just so sunken into your memory that you were able to commentate over and you'll just never forget? Maybe it was the feeling in the stadium or the actual game. It's got to be.
That's a tough question. Mainly because there's so many. I mean, having done dozens of Clásicos, each one is special, and obviously getting a chance to do it at the Camp Nou, at the Bernabeu. Hopefully we get a chance to do more of those, but that was phenomenal. Getting a chance to call a Copa America final in Chile was brilliant. I would say, though, that even though I've had the chance to call all of these games, and even being in World Cup games, like doing Germany and France and stuff, but there's something about the home game and that first Major League Soccer game where it was basically ending a 10-year drought. And there were, like I said, it was supposed to be 95, ended up getting pushed to 96. So there's even at that point the thought that this isn't real or it won't last. And now, obviously, 25 years on, even though there have been a few twists and turns, it has. That was something special to see. The national anthem, the jets flying by. I'd say another one for me was more personal, and that was going back to Lockhart Stadium, where in many ways it started for me for the first Miami Fusion game. And had to wait a couple extra years with the rest of MLS starting, but it came in. And just before kickoff, looking out the back window of the booth and just seeing the cars still lined up out of the parking lot, down the street, down that street, all the way down the expressway as far as you could see, was a rewarding feeling, because it did kind of clinch the fact in my mind that soccer was back. Then, of course, you can't take anything for granted, because 9/11 happens, economic collapse of sorts, and the Miami Fusion disappeared for another decade. And now they're finally back at Inter Miami. But even then, you kind of have to wait because of everything that's going on the last couple of years. But I would say that those two, personally, getting a chance to call U.S. games in the World Cup, and even then, little things you wouldn't imagine. I know I did a U.S. game in Barbados, sitting on top of a bus, calling some of the action, and that was thrilling. Calling a Haiti Trinidad and Tobago game from Port-au-Prince is an experience, even just leading up to the game. But it was 4 or 5 hours before the stadium was packed with all the Haitian fans, and they were just having a big party, and it was phenomenal. It's just something about this game. And like I said, when I grew up, it was football, baseball, basketball. I mean, I loved the Dodgers. The Dolphins were amazing. Remember back with Kareem and Magic and everything else like that, and even before, Gretzky playing in LA, and it was just so many things there that seemed so important and so passionate, that once you fall in love with soccer, everything else kind of pales in comparison. So I think that there are so many games, and one of the reasons that there are is because even though I grew up a fan of the team behind you, and still am to a sort, even though it's been a little harder of late, in some ways I'm kind of harder on Arsenal because of that allegiance. People kind of accuse me sometimes when I'm doing a Real Madrid game of being a Barcelona fan. When I'm a Barcelona game, they accuse me of being a Real Madrid fan, mainly because I'm trying to play off of Ray and set him up. But more and more through the years, I become more a fan of the game itself. And I can get just as much enjoyment watching my kids play an under-16 game as calling a game in the World Cup, because there's something about soccer that has all the passion, all the drama, all the athleticism and everything that I don't think any other sport does. So there are highlight moments for me. As far as there being one, I know I kind of remember 5 years ago, I think it was, one of the Clásicos where Sergio Roberto got the ball, dribbled upfield, passed off to Messi, and he just did what he does. Then another one also I know where he just got totally decked and he's on the ground bleeding, and at the end he scores the goal holding the jersey up. I mean, there's moments along the way that kind of jump out as signposts. And I guess in some ways I've been blessed to the point where it's hard to just narrow it down to one.
I think that's a fair thing to say. I mean, there's been so many huge games that you've done. You mentioned working with Ray Hudson. I did need to ask this because I've always wanted to know. Obviously, we hear it on TV whenever Messi scores, he just absolutely explodes. Does that ever catch you off guard when you're right next to him?
It's been a while since we've been right next to each other because of the way things are going with procedures and stuff. But I wouldn't say it's caught me by surprise. More, it's the turn of phrase that he has sometimes. I'm ready for kind of an explosion, but I'm not exactly sure what's going to come out sometimes. And I guess if you listen close, you'll kind of hear me laugh occasionally. It's a thrill. And I think one of the things just been so great working with him, like I said, growing up, watching him play, a lot of people ended up going to watch the strikers to see Gerd Muller, to see Nene Kobia, to see Elias Figueroa, to see Gordon Banks and all those legends of the game. But in the process, they saw Ray and this little teenager from England who really in the big picture had done nothing until he got here. They pried him away before he actually was established on Newcastle's first team. But you could see there was something special in the way that he was able to play with all of these legends of the game. And then to meet him 20 years later or whatever and find out he's exactly the same type of person in real life as you saw on the field. He's just an amazing person to work with. And I think the one thing, because we're not perfect, we're going to screw up, we're going to piss people off with maybe the way we say something. But I think one reason the fans have given us a chance by inviting us into their living rooms or every week is that they know we love the game. That the passion is real, it's not faked. And Ray is kind of passion in a bottle. So the cork's ready to pop almost any time.
You know, during you mentioned you haven't really been around Ray like when you're announcing because of COVID procedures and protocols. What's it been like transitioning to like this new style of announcing, you know, where you're not next to each other in a room, you know, like bouncing off of each other's energy, but your distance, you could be in different rooms as well. You know, is it hard to kind of announce with someone else while you're not right next to each other?
I would say for other sports and other announcers, it might be more difficult. But because of economics in this sport, there have been a number of games I've done by myself. And in fact, that tends to be the standard around the world, a single announcer. So calling a game by myself is not as hard, or to be by myself when I'm calling a game. And then also, I don't think people realize now we're starting to see it a little bit more, but even like in France, in Italy, other than like maybe the big game or two every week, a lot of those games are being called in studio. And that's basically what has happened at Goal TV and now at beIN Sports. And we're seeing it a lot more, even with Fox and ESPN, especially for the road games. So calling games remotely, being in the booth by myself, made it a little bit easier to transition with Ray, and having the fact of working with him for 15, 16, 17 years beforehand has made it a little bit easier. It might be a bit harder if you're just kind of starting out with someone because you don't know, I guess for lack of a better word, the dance steps. But thanks to modern technology, which in some ways make this possible in the first place, calling games from halfway around the globe and still being able to go and sleep in my own bed and kiss my kids goodnight is a blessing in itself. But again, through all of that, it's probably made it a little easier adjustment for me than it might be for someone that's going out doing the Monday Night Football game of the week. So they've had to adapt a lot more than I have. It's been an adaptation. There have been, for example, just little hand signals or looks when you're in the room. It's kind of like, are you done yet? Or I can kind of read that he's about to say something, or maybe where he's calling it in his room and I'm in my room, I might be thinking, okay, is he done? And be ready to say something. But again, I think fans, listeners, viewers have been quite understanding considering all of this. And like I said, again, it's the passion of the sport. So
I know you said you got to go because you got to prepare some games. So I do want to ask a question about that. We know every broadcaster prepares in their own way. What's your process when preparing for a game, big or small?
it varies, and it's changed through my career. Motion sports are different than, say, like a football or a baseball. Soccer perhaps different even more than basketball and hockey, where you have a lot more frequent substitutions. So in some ways, soccer is one of the easiest because you have your 11 and then you have your 3 or now 5 substitutions coming in. With American football, you don't know if it's going to be the 4th string tight end that ends up being the hero of the day. So you might want to have a note or two there. And you might be spending an entire week putting all these notes together and end up using 10, 15% of them during the game. For soccer, there's a lot more focus on the starting 11. And after doing them for 20 years, I kind of know a lot of that. So I would say it kind of started out using what I had done before in other sports, almost to overkill. Even to the point, not that long ago, I ended up creating a program where I'd punch all this information into a database, hit a button, print it out, and it would come out with stickers, and all I have to do is slide that down. But I actually found as easy as that made to put however tall they are, what they weigh, what they've done, how many caps they've played, and make it really, really easy, that it's a lot easier to kind of remember things as you're announcing if you write it down just beforehand. Now, if I was going to do a tournament like we did with the Copa America a few years back, where it's a short period, national teams, several players that maybe you don't know that well, I might go a little bit more into depth as in regards to filling in some of those blanks ahead of time. But conceivably, I could just wake out of bed, put a headset on, and call a Classico without even really having to think about it, because I know pretty much everything about both of those teams. However, in those situations, there's even more in those types of games than just a regular La Liga game. There's so many things that go in around it. I mean, to the point of, like, did Shakira do something that week that might be of note that you could throw in, or Antoine Griezmann having a third baby, all born on the same day. There's little things where you just kind of need to have a little color just in case. Following out, what did Piqué say this day? Back in the days with Cristiano Ronaldo, same story. What's going on in his life? So I'd say there's a lot of preparation that I do just on a regular basis, following newspapers, following Twitter feeds, etc., and just through the course of a day, keep up with. And then as I get closer and closer to the day, and especially the morning of the game, try and tie all that together. And from a young broadcaster perspective, the one thing I would kind of recommend for the most part, especially a game like soccer, is try and get as much information as you can down on paper, preferably on one sheet of paper so you're not digging through. And then at the whistle, throw it away. Because if you're too busy looking down at the paper trying to find out exactly what's going on, you're going to miss the game. As opposed to kind of do the research, know it, something happens, and that kind of pops up where you know exactly where to look. So you can kind of overdo it when it comes to information, and you can underdo it if something really happens and you weren't ready for it. So you got to try and find that happy medium. The other point being, and I guess maybe it helped being a goalkeeper in my youth, you got to be ready. You got to be prepared for when you make a mistake. If it's a little one, just kind of brush it off. If it's a bigger one, address it and move on. If your partner makes a mistake, it's probably better to let them correct it, which is a lot easier when they're in the same room. Just kind of point and let them say it, as opposed to making it sound like there's some tension between you. But the whole point is, if you try and dwell on every single mistake, you're always going to be behind the play, making more mistakes. So no one's expecting you to be perfect. Most of the TV screens that people are watching at home are much better than what we're watching at. And sometimes even when you're in person, it can be even more difficult, because as opposed to trying to pick out someone that's on the far side of the screen, you're looking at someone that could be half a mile away, it seems. So don't expect yourself to be perfect. Try your best. If there is a mistake, just shake it off, move on, and you can always address things at the end of the game. It's like what happens between the whistles, what happens between the chalk lines stays there.
Well, Phil, thank you so much for coming on today. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to talk to a couple of teenagers.
It was a pleasure, and maybe we can do it again sometime when there's more time. But no, it's a beautiful game. It's been a blessing, and I hope you guys have a chance to enjoy it much, much more into the future.
Thank you so much. All right, guys, that does it for this episode of Inside the D. We'll see you in the next one.